Would you all rise for the Pledge of Allegiance? I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Ladies and gentlemen, you came tonight for a debate. Unfortunately, Mr. Mackenzie is in legislative session. He will not be making it. We learned officially about 20 minutes ago, but there is a person here who is going to be the proxy spokesman for him. His name is Gary Burks. So, Mr. Burks, would you come up and he's going to make a statement, and then he's going to go, and then the program will be turned over to Mr. Beitler.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. My name is Gary Burks. Little about myself. I live in North Catasauqua. I was a founding member of a group called CAT back in the 90s, called Catasauqua Area Concerned Taxpayers, that was formed about the same time CEPTA was doing great things with the East Penn School District. And I'm also an Army vet and proud to be on Ryan Mackenzie's campaign. Ryan couldn't make it here today. There's obviously a session day is going on. He was trying to make it after the session was over, but they got called into a caucus meeting at 4:45, so he sent me on his behalf. So we apologize for that. I'd just like to read a quick statement, and then I'm going to have to leave. Representative Mackenzie sends his regrets he cannot be here tonight. As this event was being planned, the representative notified the organization that today was a session day in Harrisburg and attending would be difficult, if not impossible. If a non-session date had been chosen, Ryan would have been here in person to address you. He did, however, ask me to convey that he shares the concerns of your group over property taxes and fiscal discipline in government, and let you know a little about his record. As state representative, Ryan has been a consistent supporter of property tax elimination and has voted in favor of it. Ryan has also supported measures such as reducing the number of exceptions to Act 1 that make it harder for school districts to raise property taxes. He voted in favor of public pension reform that is bending the cost curve and will save taxpayers at the local and state level billions of dollars over time. Ryan stopped Governor Wolf's disastrous tax and spending increase planned 2 years ago 2 years in a row. This plan would have taken more money from the taxpayers of our community and sent it to Philadelphia and Pittsburgh. Ryan has never voted for a tax or fee increase on the people of the 134th District. Instead, he has worked hard to control spending, cut waste, and make the state live within its means. During last year's budget discussions, he was part of legislative group that identified hundreds of millions of dollars in unused tax dollars sitting in numerous agencies across the government. Their goal was to use this money to fund the budget rather than to turn to taxpayers for more. The governor disagreed, once again pushing for new and higher taxes. Tonight, I am sure you will hear claims about many things. Again, it is unfortunate the event was planned on a session day and prevents the representative from being here to answer questions. That is why we have provided everyone with handout cards, and I will leave some on the table back here. I was going to pass them out, but it's just more convenient back there. And let me see, where did I leave off? This card includes contact information, and Representative Mackenzie asks that you please contact if you have any questions. And I can attest to the fact, if you call him and ask him a question, whether it's a political question or about state issues, Ryan will return the phone call. And he says thank you, and again, we appreciate the offer to this. If any of you want to talk to Ryan or meet with him personally, Ryan and I will be at your door. She'll call us and we'll be glad to be there. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Right.
On behalf of the Concerned East Penn Taxpayers Association, I want to give you a little background. Mr. Mackenzie did indicate that it was a legislative session and attendance would be difficult. We did still leave it open in case he could make it, which the gentleman indicated that he was going to try. And we also then offered an opportunity to send a proxy to fill in for his spot in the debate. But if he could have made it, we would have had the debate, and we left that open as a possibility. Unfortunately, the legislature is still in session. So now we want to turn it over to Ron Beitler. Mr. Beitler is a commissioner in Lower Mackenzie Township and a candidate for the 134th legislative seat.
We'll just swap. Hello. Can everyone hear me all right? How are we doing today? So, April 17th, tax day. Everyone excited to pay your fair share today? No? Not so much? Didn't think so. So question for folks on, given to celebrate tax day here, a couple of questions. I thought I'd do a little informal poll here. Everyone in here, I assume, or most of the folks in here, I'm assuming, own their house and pay their school property tax. So how many of you, just as a show of hands, over the last 5 years have seen at least one increase in your school property tax bills? Raise your hand. Every single person. Okay, how many of you have seen at least 2 increases in your school property tax bills over the last 5 years? About 90%. Okay, interesting. How many of you have seen an increase in your municipal property tax bills over the last 5 years? Again, the majority, just about everyone. So if you are a resident of Lower Mackenzie Township, you're actually one of the few people who saw your municipal property tax bills go down over the last couple of years. And in fact, if you're about 80% of the residents in our township have seen their property tax bills go down twice over the last 4 years, and 10% of our residents, or 1,100 of our 11,000 residents, actually pay no residential property tax. So I thought we'd start off with that to celebrate, tax day here. So for those of you who don't know me, we'll give you a little bit of a background, and then I guess we'll open it up for questions. Many of you here I am familiar with. I've had the opportunity to speak in front of CEPTA, I think probably about 3 or 4 times over the last couple of years. And as always, John, Otto, Lynn, and the organizers, etc. Thanks as always for the opportunity. I think the last time I was here, I was actually here with Scott Ott to talk about the TIF. And I try to come every now and then just to update folks on Lower Mac issues. So as a matter of background, I'm 39 years old, and before I forget, because I think she needs to go home, but I just wanted to take a moment and embarrass my wife over there. So Amanda Beitler is my wife over there, and she was nice enough to come out tonight and listen to me talk about politics. And so thank you very much, sweetie. But she's going to take off soon because our kid is actually up with a sitter now, so she's going to go home and be with our daughter. So 39 years old, I'm a local resident. I grew up here in the village of East Texas, if any of you are familiar. I'm an Emmaus High School graduate from 1998, and I'm a proud graduate of a state system university. I went to Slippery Rock University, graduated from there in 2005. And as a matter of professional background, for the last 10 years, I've been a small business owner. So myself and 2 partners, we own a small business. What we do is we do event production, so ranging the gamut from photography to films to photo booths, lighting, DJs, live bands, etc. We do about 80 weddings a year, and that's the bread and butter. And seasonally, depends. We ramp up in the summer, but we have about 11 employees during the summer months when we're doing the bulk of our weddings. About 70% of weddings happen in the summer, spring, and fall months. And we also have a digital media wing, too, called Studio Kiwi. And there we do production of commercials for other small business. We do a little bit of corporate work. And last year, what we're proud of is we actually shot and produced a pilot for HDTV. Local fella had an idea for a show called Homebody Challenge, and we shot that half-hour pilot. And unfortunately, it didn't get on broadcast HGTV, but it did get on HGTV.com. So that was sort of the crowning achievement of the digital link. So we're hoping in the future to do some more of that. So small business owner for 10 years, and I think that gives me a little bit of a different perspective coming into this race. I've been a township commissioner now for about 4 years. So I ran 5 years ago, 2013, I ran for township commissioner. And since I got to fill all the time tonight, I guess I'll go into a little bit more detail about that for those of you who don't know. So 2013, how I sort of cut my teeth in getting into local politics. There was an issue, a fairly high-profile land use issue in Lower Mackenzie Township where there was 700 acres of land that for 23 years was zoned agricultural protection. And some folks in this room were involved in raising awareness about that. Rob, thank you. And so I and others who live in the township felt as though a major decision about the future of this land was made in a very untransparent fashion. So I and others, we actually raised money, I think it was about $32,000, to challenge this decision made by the commissioners at the time in courts. And it turns out that a local Commonwealth judge actually agreed with us that the township commissioners at the time did not advertise this decision. So of course, local residents then did not have a chance to weigh in. It was done in a very untransparent fashion. You can argue or not whether or not it was unethical, but it was certainly done in an untransparent fashion. So that's how I got activated and engaged. Unfortunately, at the end of the day, we weren't able to overturn that decision, but we were able to force some concessions that, in my opinion, represent a better government at the end of the day, more transparent government. So then coming out of that, we got frustrated. We were coming to meetings, standing at the podium, talking to commissioners, asking questions and getting sort of blank stares in response. They were listening, but they weren't really listening, and they weren't really responding to us. And so what do you do when you're in that situation? Eventually you get to the point where, well, hey, I'm going to run. And so I, myself and another gentleman did that. And so we ran for township commissioner against the incumbents, and we actually defeated them. And I think that first election, myself and the other gentleman got the highest number of votes in township history, which I'm very proud of. And understand that the incumbents, they actually raised money in a municipal race. I think they raised about $10,000, and they actually ran television ads in a municipal township race, which was pretty insane. So, so we ran for that, and I became a township commissioner about 4 years ago. And in that position over the last 4 years, some of the things I'm most proud of, we actually, like I said earlier, we're one of the few townships on this side of the state, I believe, that actually utilized the homestead program to reduce our residential property taxes. Now, a little bit of the weeds of how we do that. So up until last November, when of course you all participated in that referendum to increase the minimum amount that we're allowed to exclude, we had ramped up to 50% of the median, which is the maximum allowed. And over the course of the next 3 years, we're game planning through the budget process to actually exclude our residential property tax up to 100%. So in other words, we would be eliminating the residential property taxes for primary residents. We're going to talk about Senate Bill 76, I'm sure, a little bit later. But the homestead mechanism makes a lot of sense for the municipality, and I can explain why. So we use the homestead for the maximum amount we're allowed to now, and moving forward, we plan to do a 100% exclusion. So the question always is, well, how are you going to replace that revenue? And the answer in Lower Mackenzie Township is, we're not. We only, and this is sort of a unique thing to us, and I think a sort of an innovative thing, we only use our municipal property tax at all to fund capital improvements. So we don't use our municipal property tax to fund general fund spending. So in other words, recurring expense, year-to-year expenses, we don't use the property tax to fund that at all. So if we increase the homestead, that's true, we're not going to have as much revenue, but our tact is, well, we're going to live within the means of that reduced revenue, and what that means, we're going to be more surgical with our capital projects and maybe even do less capital projects. We'll just have to plan better. So we're planning ahead to be able to do that. Relating back to the original issue of why I got involved, so in Lower Mackenzie Township, obviously our 32,000 residents are very concerned about our growth issues. You can't stop growth, nor do we want to do that. Our intent is just to guide growth to more appropriate places where it makes sense, and that's a measurable thing. In other words, it's where the infrastructure already exists, so taxpayers aren't on the hook for infrastructure improvements relative to, say, a new warehouse that comes into the township. So for the last 4 years, instead of being in the business of rezoning our farmland for warehouses, we're actually now in the business of preserving farmland, and I'm also the treasurer of the Lehigh County Farmland Preservation Board. So over the last 4 years, we've preserved 300 acres of farmland and open space in Lower Mackenzie Township, and that's something I'm pretty proud of. We are, and I can say this with certainty, we're the most transparent township in the Lehigh Valley, and I'd bargain we could go pound for pound with anyone in the state. All our meetings are recorded and televised both on RCN and Service Electric. They're also recorded and put up onto our website. So for 2 weeks after the event, after the meeting, you can go online and watch our meeting in its entirety. The week prior to every one of our meetings we put not only the agenda online, but the agenda detail online. So every single item that we're considering on the night of one of our board meetings, we have every relevant detail of that item on our agenda before the meetings. We also have public comment periods, not only before and after every meeting begins and ends, but also during. So anytime there's a motion on an item or a vote on an item, the public has the opportunity to weigh in and talk on this issue. So unfortunately, some of you who attend school board meetings on a regular basis, you know that that's not necessarily always the case. You're most of the time limited to commenting only before the meeting and only if you sign in. So you can't just, if there's something that comes up during the course of a meeting and you're interested in it, you usually don't have the flexibility to speak to that. In Lower Mac, you can. You can raise your hand and talk on any agenda item or non-agenda item before or after or during the meeting. So that's just a little background, my professional background, local background, and some of the things we've done in Lower Mac. So at this time, I'm very interested in what your questions are. So I guess Otto has a mic, and he can,
Can you hear me?
Hands and,
okay. If you want to ask a question, raise your hand and we'll get the mic to you because we are recording it. Oh, we can have you come up to the empty mic, which we'll put a mic there. Any questions?
Yeah, I guess the most important question is, what are you going to do to help solve the pension crisis that we have in this state, where we're in debt to the tune of, $60 billion?
$66 billion.
Yeah. That needs to be fixed immediately, and will you stand up to the special interest that's going to cause pain to the existing defined benefit pension plans?
Right. So that's an excellent question, and one of the most important things that any candidate for state rep or incumbent in state rep has to deal with. So the pension liability, as everyone in this room is well aware of, is potentially and currently crippling to the state's finances. I think it's the PSERS and the SERS alone. The liability is now upwards. I think the number is $66 billion. So let's back up a little bit. I guess it was 3 years ago, there was sort of a measure taken that, in my opinion, represents a half measure. New hires are now in some sort of hybrid stacked plan, but it's not getting to what, in my opinion, is the solution, which is all new hires starting tomorrow need to come in and be brought into a defined contribution plan. To me, that's essential and a no-brainer and absolutely critical to avoid and address not only the existing issues, but to avoid the condition worsening as we move forward in the future. So I think that everyone in this room, and even Ryan, if he were here, would agree that that's the problem. But the real question here is, why doesn't it get done? Because this isn't rocket science, right? This is a math equation. And right now, we know that the math doesn't work. And not only does the math doesn't work now, but it's going to get worse as we keep moving forward in time. So the question then is, when the incumbent came into office 6 years ago, if you all remember correctly, and I'm sure you do, we had the governor. We had Tom Corbett as the governor. We had the state senate and we had the state house. So, and in fact, if he were here, we asked each other 3 questions, and one of my questions to him would have been, you were here for 2 years when we had all 3 houses, so what was the problem? Why didn't we move that ball forward during that time? We know what the problem is. We know what the solution is, so why aren't we getting that done? And I think the answer is, as you alluded to it, is the outsized influence of special interest groups in Pennsylvania politics, which is crippling. So how do you address that? And this is a recurring theme of my campaign. Is I think, unfortunately, in the state of Pennsylvania, we have an epidemic where well-intentioned folks, let's even say well-meaning folks, run for office, get in, and then unfortunately, once it becomes their career and pension, they become unwilling or unable to make the tough decisions that need to happen. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the one, leads to what I believe is the one essential and critical government reform, and that is an enaction of term limits in the Pennsylvania State House and Senate. That's how we solve that problem, because we know what the solution is, we know what the problem is, but year after year it doesn't get done, including, 4 or 5 years ago, I think it was, when we had, Republicans had, conservatives had, the governor, the Senate, and the State House. So.
Ryan, could I follow up?
Please.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's the easy answer, and that's the obvious answer. The
Yeah.
hard answer is, do you shut off the defined benefit pension plans right now, continue with the obligations that we've already promised, but stop it day one, no more defined benefit pension plan, you automatically go into 401k?
Yeah, for new hires, day one, defined
Talking
benefit
existing
pension plans.
people.
For existing teachers, the conversation does get a little more muddy, because then there is the question of, do we have the obligation to honor the promises that were made by past state governments? So, but you can, and I'm not trying to dance here, but the answer is we're not even addressing what is the obvious and easy part. So
You address the hard part.
which is the complete solution.
Yep.
Yeah, I think you have to have that tough conversation, and it is a tough conversation. So again, that relates back to why are career politicians so remiss to not have those tough conversations? And the answer is that they become more concerned about their next re-election instead of making the next term. Because sometimes you make the hard election, and guess what happens? Next time you're up for office, you're facing the full strength and fervor of the special interest groups that are really invested in status quo.
Term limits would solve that.
Term limits would solve it. Yep. Yeah. Mr. Brown.
Just 1 second. I have some information. This came right from Harrisburg from a reliable source. The legislative session ended between 4:30 and 5 o'clock. The caucus ended before 5 o'clock. Just for your information.
Dean Browning, I just wanted to follow up on the pension topic.
Sure.
Since we're on that. One of my main concerns is the unfunded liabilities, and in my opinion, the fact that they're understated. You mentioned coming up with a solution. To me, the first step is defining and understanding how big the problem is, and we don't know how big the problem is. And the reason we don't is that government in their accounting use overinflated assumptions on returns. They do accounting, quite honestly, and I've spoken before to folks here at CEPTA, if I did accounting the way the government does, if I did that in my company, I wouldn't be here because I would be in jail. So my question to you is, and again, I would encourage you, one of the first things I think you should do is change how they account for the pensions, make them use realistic assumptions so that all of us know how big the problem is. I think that is what we need to drive action, to understand how big the problem is and how much each of us owes because of the pension system.
Right. No, I completely agree, Dean, and I think you and I would be in agreement. Operating businesses in the real world, having to balance checkbooks, we know that fuzzy math doesn't work when you have to make a payroll, so, and you have bills to pay. So, I completely agree with you. I mean, that's the easy answer there. So thank you, Dean. Yeah.
Started writing things down.
Sure.
I agree with you. The problem here is, and you can, in terms of government reform, is one word: incumbency. That's what's stopping government reform. When people get in, every candidate that comes here has a better idea.
Sure.
Okay, regardless of what's going on, we don't want the incumbents in there, because otherwise people like yourself would not be running if you didn't think you had a better idea for most of this. But so it's incumbency, as you pointed out earlier. Government collection of teachers' unions' dues, which is a problem with respect to forcing teachers to pay dues to the unions, even if they would not want to to do so. Do you have a response to that?
Should we be doing? Should we be using? So the question is should we be using public dollars to collect public union dues? The answer is no. I mean, certainly not. And to address the first part of your question, I'm not running for office because I think I'm smarter than the folks who are in here in office right now, and including the incumbent. He's a Harvard guy. He went to NYU, he went to Harvard. So I'm not up here saying that I have the better solutions or the smarter solutions or proposing things that haven't been proposed for years, because that's exactly the problem. And to Rob's question about the pension liability, it's not rocket science. We know what the solution is. The issue is that we're just not doing it. So school property tax elimination, SB 76, not a new idea. And in fact, that's been an idea that's been floated, I think, for 20 years. That's fair to say. I know I've been following it closely for about 10 years, but the idea and the legislation and the citizen group that's been working with, I think it's Representative Cox to draft that and propose that, that's not a new idea. And again, it's not rocket science either. So it's not necessarily an issue of getting new people in because their ideas are better. It's getting new people in who commit to term limits, who are willing to get off the pot and make the hard decisions. That's what needs to happen. So that's why I keep referring back to, why doesn't that happen? That's what I fixate on in the question. And as far as, incumbents who stand up and defend incumbency or argue against term limits, that, it takes time to take your training wheels off, to get up to speed and make things happen. That's a cop-out the way I see it. And it's really kind of, narcissistic to think that you're the only one who could possibly do that job in a district of 65,000 people. Because again, it isn't rocket science. And with a lot of these structural issues that we face, the solutions are out there right now. You just need people who are willing to move the ball forward. So 2 clear answers. One, on the first one, again, it's a term limits thing. And on the second one, no, we shouldn't be using public dollars to collect public union dues. And I think that was a hot button topic 2 years ago. And unfortunately, our state senator voted against that legislation, I believe, correct? Yeah, which was the wrong decision. I would have been a vote for that legislation. A vote for the legislation to take away that ability. If it's such a good thing, why don't people volunteer to do it?
If I had a choice between someone's education background and utilizing their common sense when they make decisions, I think I would go with that. Can I just point out 3 other things? When you're out with folks, please. I'm sorry. Let me say, I've had an interest in, I'm from Emmaus. I have an interest in Lower Mackenzie Township. I drive through it every week. I utilize Sauerkraut Lane, and there are for sale signs for development all over Sauerkraut Lane, especially the eastern portion of it now. That's all farmland, okay? So I know you're talking about trying to do something that sort of protects the farmland out there. But those are cornfields, and I think there were soybean fields too, that someone is trying to sell for development, the owner. The other thing is a municipal police department in Lower Mackenzie Township. And I know there's been talk about that, but nothing has been done about it. And it's state tax dollars that are used, and my tax dollars from Emmaus in responding to problems that arise, emergencies in Lower Mackenzie Township.
Can I, cause those are two meaty ones. So can I jump into them one at a time?
Let me just give you one more.
Okay, so 3 is. Yeah.
Okay, one more.
They're good questions.
A few years ago, you were taking in so much income from real estate transfer taxes that you did not collect your municipal property tax for a number of years. And now you're back collecting it again, right?
Yep.
And though I like the idea that you're using it mostly for capital expenditures, but still, you're back collecting that tax again. And I know there's still development going, excuse the expression, hog wild out in Lower Mackenzie Township. So I'm not sure why you went back to collecting the property tax, or not collecting it again, especially since, I think the township should be providing its own municipal police services and not relying on the state police.
Okay, so 3 questions that I want to give you very thorough answers on all 3. So the first one was the land use one, correct?
Yes.
Just
Sauerkraut Lane.
Sauerkraut Lane. So the signs on Sauerkraut Lane. So you're absolutely right. When those big green signs went up at the corner of Sauerkraut Lane and Brookside Road, you wouldn't believe the amount of correspondence that I got within 24 hours of that. I think that was the single biggest catalyst for my inbox getting filled up than any other single issue in the 4 years I've been a commissioner. So our township residents, our 32,000 township residents are very concerned about our growth issues in the township. I can tell you over the last 4 years, we've preserved the 300 acres of farmland and open space in the township. Now, when I say we preserved farmland and open space, I want to talk about this a little bit and sort of hone in on this, because this relates to a larger philosophical question. So our Board of Commissioners right now, number 1, we do not believe in downzoning properties, okay? So for 23 years, large swaths of farmland in Lower Mac were preserved via zoning. And at certain times, a landowner had a certain underlying zone, and then boards of commissioners came in and decided, well, we're going to downzone your property outside of the scope of comprehensive plans. When that happens, that is a taking. That's a taking of private property rights, and it's wrong. Now, there are certain circumstances where that should be considered within the framework of a multi-municipal or regional comprehensive plan, but that would be, the only exception. So, Lower Mac, we believe and we're committed to, when we have the strategic goal of preserving farmland, we enter the market and we compensate landowners, because that's the fair and right thing to do. So we've been doing that over the last 3 years in partnership with Lehigh County. So when we say we preserve farmland, we say to landowner, here's the value of the development rights of your property. We get an appraisal done and we compensate them that value. And the other added benefit is not only is that the fair thing to do, it's also permanent. It cannot be overturned. So specifically, the parcel you mentioned on Brookside and Sauerkraut, that's a big one, 220 acres. 220 acres, and that could be developed tomorrow by right based on the current zoning code with about 300 homes, okay? So if that happens, and this is why the township's committed to investing in farmland and open space, if that landowner would move forward a development plan to build those 300 homes, there are costs associated with that. So there's costs of development. So there's an impact on the school district, right? If we work very closely with the administration. They just did a demographics study, I think it was 3 or 4 years ago. And what that study showed us is we're kind of plateauing now, and we're sort of at a crossroads on whether or not East Penn School District is going to have to invest upwards of $130 million on a new high school or middle school, That largely depends on whether or not Lower Mac and Upper Milford go crazy off the rails with development or not, or if we keep doing what we are doing and investing in preservation. So you can bet, you're seeing tax increases on an almost yearly basis now if your school bills. If we have to fund the construction of $130 million capital expense in the form of a middle school, elementary school, or high school, you and I are the ones who are going to have to pay for that. And not only that, but the cost on our infrastructure as well. And the fact that we're losing, irreplaceable, prime, regionally significant farmland, which in and of itself is a form of industrial infrastructure, and let's not lose sight of that. The farming industry in Lehigh County is a $17 million industry reliant on industrial infrastructure, and that industrial infrastructure is farmland, and once you pave it over, it can't be replaced. So that specific property where they could build the 300 houses, all I can say is in the next 2 weeks, the township is there's going to be an announcement. The township is working closely, and has been for the last year and a half, with that landowner to preserve exactly the parcel that you mentioned, which, if it does end up happening, would be game changing. So question number 2 was the local police force. Yes, sir.
Could you do me one favor? Could you just tell everybody who owns that property?
It's the Wiener estate.
It's Doc Wiener.
Doc Wiener, yeah. So
Doc Wiener is the one that owns the property for.
If we could use a microphone or something then too, Bill,
Yeah.
please, if we're going to have this conversation.
Just to let everybody know, I know Doc Wiener, he's long gone at this point, but the issue is that he owns a number of properties. One property happens to be Lower Mackenzie Road, Brookside Road, which is across the street from the gas station. I forget how many acres that is, but he owns a number of acres, and the family is now trying to divest and sell that property. I believe in that we should preserve that property, because the traffic on Brookside Road, for those of you who live out there, is horrendous now. And I really don't want my school property taxes to go up anymore.
Yeah, exactly. So it's as simple as, with farmland preservation in a rapidly growing township, it's you spend $1 today to preserve a farm, or you spend $3 later on the schools, the infrastructure, et cetera, and the services. So the police force question. Correct. Lower Mackenzie does not have a police force, and I do not support enacting one. No way. And let me dig into that a little bit. So, related to the pension issue, we always focus on the teacher pensions, and none of us in here want to pick on teachers, and we're not. We all understand that we're not. We're just looking at a math problem and want to make something. We want to make a math problem work and want to make a system sustainable. But the other half of that are police pensions and municipal pensions and firefighter pensions. They're facing the same exact problems where, unfortunately, a lot of communities are faced with defined contribution plans that just aren't sustainable, and that's why the private sector moved away from them. So until we solve that problem, would I be in favor of taking the township into that sort of position? The answer is absolutely not, without question. Not until we have things like Act 111, binding arbitration reform. Right now, if a union comes in, let's say we had a local police force and they came in to negotiate their benefits, et cetera, and salaries, with the current system of binding arbitration, they have us, the proverbial over the bucket, and there's nothing we can do. There's very few tools that a municipality has to fight for fair arbitration until we reform that system. So we're allowed to do that, and that's the problem. And two sides of this coin. As long as Lower Mackenzie Township is allowed to do that, and as long as my job is to represent those 32,000 residents, I think we would be insane to move to a local police force, because the startup costs would be $6 million, and we'd be faced with the liability of $2.5 million per year recurring onward, and that cost is not going to be stable. That cost is going to go up. So the question is it fair for the state to enact some kind of per capita fee on municipalities like Lower Mac, who have a large population and we're rapidly suburbanizing? Yes, and in fact that was proposed last year. The governor proposed a $25 per capita fee on every one of our residents. If that were to be passed tomorrow, the answer for Lower Mac is still stay with the state police, and I think the whole board is in unison on that, because then we're paying a share to the state, and I think that's fair, and that number could even go up a little bit, but we're not saddling our local community with those local pension liabilities. So what was your third part?
The real estate transfer tax.
Okay.
Ties into that.
Right.
Because you weren't collecting your...
No, yeah, we weren't. For a number of years, Lower Mac had no millage. And to be crystal clear on this, we have a millage now. It's 1/2 mil. It's the smallest mill of any community in the entire suburban community in the entire Lehigh Valley. We maintain that tiny fractional millage because of two things. One, giant shopping centers, and two, warehouses. Without that tiny millage in place, which is again smaller than any other suburban community in the Lehigh Valley, we would be collecting no revenue from the warehouses, which we have in our community, for better or worse. I and others have been banging the drum for years about the folly of rezoning your farmland for these industrial warehouses that employ very few people, and that's not going to get better. That's going to get worse moving forward as they become more automated, that gobble up huge acres of our farmland and create massive strains on our local infrastructure. So yes, we, with our 1/2 mil on a building that's, say 1.2 million square foot, we collect, you'd be shocked on how little we collect from them. It's about $24,000 a year. But we need that. Every little bit helps, because we're the ones, Lower Mackenzie Township, when we have a warehouse built in our township, we're the ones that have to deal with the truck traffic, build the new turning lanes, traffic signals, capacity improvements, et cetera, et cetera. So yes, definitely. We are using Homestead. We're interested in eliminating the residential property tax, but maintaining our very, very small millage on large commercial uses like warehouses and shopping centers.
I have a microphone back here. The gentleman has a handicap, so I'm going to give him the microphone. But before I do, I have one follow-up response. You talked about the arbitration with police at developing. I can speak to that. I have 10 years as a municipal councilman. You are behind the 8 ball as a municipality. When the police union goes to contract and they go to arbitration, the arbitrator sees the municipal lawyer once every 4 years. They see the union lawyer every month. Yes, and the union lawyer can also then decide, well, I don't like that arbitrator, and kick him off the panel. So guess who the arbitrator is going to rule in favor of most of the time? That's my comment. And
yeah. No, thank you. And I know you understand that issue firsthand, and that's exactly my point. For as long as the state allows us to do this, we would be insane to move away to a system where we have to deal with that problem, where the odds are stacked so severely against us. So yeah,
I remember it is, believe me, it's frustrating. Okay, this gentleman has a question.
Yes, Pennsylvania has the highest number of veterans. And as a former combat Vietnam veteran, and I am on 2 different boards, one in Lehigh County and in the Veterans Brotherhood. I don't believe that most people understand how many folks we take off the streets on a weekly basis out of a car that served in Vietnam, and they have PTSD. And it is so pathetic and disgusting to me that our government in Lehigh County, the state government, and the federal just PS money away and give walk-around money, cars to the state reps, lodging, food, yada, yada, yada. And I'm so disgusted with it, I can't stand it. And I got an email today from a commander in one of our units that started a GoFundMe for someone who was imprisoned by North Korea for a number of years. You probably read it in the paper today. And they're asking the public to help this gentleman out who they need to. But to think our own government, and you know what? I say one thing to all of you, and if you're offended, that's your problem. Thank God for President Trump, who really wants to do something for our veterans. He's the only one that has the courage to stand up. I recently heard Marty Osteen say he would not vote for that budget. We are in deep trouble in our military because Barack Obama has debilitated our budget, our government for 8 years, our military budget. My question to you is, what do you plan on doing at a state level to help us help the veterans where we are in this state? Because we have a lot of veterans that are, well, like I say, we have the largest number of veterans in the state of Pennsylvania. What are you proposing we could do to help us veterans? And thank you.
Sure, thank you. Yeah, so the biggest single thing we can do to help homeless veterans in the state of Pennsylvania is to eliminate the school property tax entirely. So, I mean, and I don't want to, of course, you know, everyone feels an obligation to the men and women who served in the military. But for any person who's homeless because they can't afford, you know, a property tax bill and they're losing their home for that issue, you know, that's problematic. So, you know, the single biggest thing we could do to address the problem that you referenced, you know, the county coming in and having to help a homeless veteran who's living in their car, is to entirely and completely eliminate the school property tax and get that veteran into a home. So.
My question ties in with the pensions.
Sure.
And also the property taxes. You mentioned earlier about putting people in 401ks. If they would go into 401ks, are we going to have the same people handle that money? Or is this going to be outside people that will handle the money? That's my first question.
You were the gentleman who gave the presentation here a couple. Yeah. So I think I came to your presentation, and it was really good. And I think you can probably teach me about this issue. Yeah. So.
You get elected. You want my help? I'll be there.
I will be ringing you up. Yeah. So yeah, when CEPTA, when Otto put out the flyer to that, and I read your background, you know, I definitely wanted to make sure I was here for that one, and I was. So. I mean, one of the things you need to do when you get in these positions is know when you're out of your league and not look at folks like this and try to BS an answer. And I won't do that. You know, you would be an example of a person that I would seek out, you know, to answer that question. So
I want to share this with you and everybody here. One of my clients is a member of the SCRS, since retired. She got her quarterly newsletter where they said they made 15% last year.
Right.
Question is, when you look at the annual report, they didn't make 15. How can they get away with telling people things that are not true? They only made 4.5% last year.
Right. Well, I suspect that's a matter of folks who are invested in propping up the status quo, wanting to mess with the numbers, you know, to make the problem look not as bad as it is. So that's obviously problematic. Yep.
Anyone else? Mr. Browning.
Before I ask my question, I just want to make an announcement. I just got a news flash that former First Lady Barbara Bush has passed away at the age of 92. My question to you concerns Second Amendment issues. With the recent shooting in Florida, there's a big hue and cry about we should ban certain types of weapons, increase the age limit for purchasing firearms, a whole host of things. Can you give us an overview of where you are on those positions? Are there any firearms that you think should be banned? What's your opinion of changing the age limit? How would you approach this issue?
I don't, to answer go down the list of specific things you asked, I don't think that messing with the age limit would solve anything. So I would oppose that in the state legislature. One of the solutions that I've been reading about, would generally be supportive of, is there are 18 states in the nation that currently. So to back up a second, there was a narrative put out there of should we arm teachers, and if so, how do we do that? So to address that issue, there are 18 states in the union right now that currently allow a teacher who has a permit to carry to bring that weapon into school. Now, in different states, the specifics of it are different. In some states, there's school districts that have policies in place where they allow it, but there's protocol where the district needs to know about it and certain liability has to be dealt with. But the bottom line is that teacher who already has their permit to carry can bring their weapon into school in a concealed fashion, and 99% of the time, guess what? The students in those classrooms don't even know it's there. But if there's someone in there who wants to cause harm to the students, you better be darn sure that the students will quickly become aware that that teacher is armed and proficient with their weapon and is carrying in the school situation. So the question is, why are we not one of those 18 states that doesn't allow a teacher who wants to be armed, is proficient with their weapon, has a carry permit, to bring that permit into schools so that they're able to protect themselves and the students who are in their charge? And we're reading all these sort of silly and insane things that are being floated out there. I mean, there was a story in the paper, there were two over the last month. One was, there's a school district up north that wanted to arm teachers with buckets of rocks. That's the second one. There was another school district that wanted to arm teachers with little mini baseball bats.
No, the story was that they had rocks in their head.
Rocks in their head. Maybe that's the case. But to me, I think 18 states have it right. That I'm not sure that we ought to be forcing teachers to be armed. But if there are 18 states that if you do have your permit and you want to bring your weapon into school to protect yourself and students in your charge, you can do that. We're one of the states that do not allow that. So those of you who are concerned with Second Amendment issues, as I'm sure most of you know, it's a constitutional issue, but the Pennsylvania state constitution is even more clear on it than the federal constitution, and it is an issue that does come up in the state legislature. So as I'm sure most of you, I'm probably preaching to the choir here, but as most of you know, there have been a number of issues over the past couple of years where individual municipalities try to overstep their bounds and enact local gun control legislation more stringent than what the state and federal constitution allows. Clearly that's problematic. What then happens? They try to do that. The NRA comes in and sues appropriately. That legislation gets sued, and what have we gotten for that exercise? Taxpayers wasted a heck of a lot of money on a frivolous exercise. So this is something, you bet that this is something that state legislators have to be prepared for and vote on a fairly frequent basis. So.
Another question? I've got one.
Sure, keep them coming.
I've been on the bandwagon, excuse me, I've been on the bandwagon with this since Doug Reichley was in the State House. We all are concerned about rising taxes, and specifically the power of the teachers' unions. But the state election law needs to be addressed. Right now, judicial candidates and school board candidates can cross-file rather than declare for a party. And the reason that this is a problem is that in the primaries, there's only maybe 15% of the voters go to vote. The teachers' union packs their people out, and by the time you get to the general election, it's all over. That's how their power is. I would suggest that you amend the election code and make them declare for a party.
Yeah, that's proposed right now. So there's legislation pending in the State House that would propose that, and I think it is insincere to be able to crossfire. The folly of that is that ability was actually enacted to try to eliminate partisanship in school board in school board elections, and that didn't end up being the case. But you hit the nail on the head of the bigger issue is, I never understood this, I never will understand this, but why do only 15% of voters come out and vote in these local elections that impact you? Now, we're all concerned with stuff happening on the national level, and we're all up to date, and that's very important, but the things that happen on the local level and the state level impact you pound for pound on a daily basis, 20 times more than anything you're voting for, concerning national politics. So why do those 85% of people don't vote? I mean, they're our neighbors, right? I don't understand that. I don't know what we can do to fix that. I read an interesting proposal the other day where there was some legislation, I think, in Harrisburg to require locally drafted civics tests that would have to be administered in 8th grade. Maybe that's a part of the solution to ingrain in folks as they're coming from school. There are narratives out there that we're ingraining them with some things, but why aren't we ingraining them with basic civics and the importance of voting in local elections on a regular basis, the elections that impact you on a daily basis? So, yeah. So good question. Yeah, John.
Questions for prevailing wage. And a lot of these things tied together as far as driving costs up for the taxpayer. And it's just one of those things where anytime the government quotes for any kind of work, especially school districts, whatever, anybody, any $1 used of any of the state money throws the prevailing wage, which means basically union work, which means at least 18% more costly than standard labor would be in the private sector. How do you feel on stuff like that?
So we deal with prevailing wage issues on a regular basis in Lower Mackenzie Township, and it stinks. Every project we try to do in our park system, we hit that threshold that hasn't been touched. So to back up, not assuming everyone is up on this, the threshold that triggers prevailing wage, so again, those artificial increased wages for certain projects, that threshold hasn't been touched in 44 years. So it hasn't been adjusted for inflation. It hasn't been touched in any way, shape, or form for 4 decades. So every project we try to do in the township, something as benign as a bathroom renovation project at Camp Olympic, is costing us, upwards of 18 to 30% more of every dollar that we put out. And it's not just, that's kind of the obvious, is the dollars and cents of it. But it's also the time and the burden put on our staff. Once a project is triggered for prevailing wage, the thing that's harder to reconcile is the amount of staff time that our township employees put in to reconcile that bureaucratic paperwork, and that makes the problem even more exponentially worse. So that's one of those intersections between local government and state government. And yes, we need to address the prevailing wage. Let's take into account, if you're good, bad, or indifferent on the idea that there's a prevailing wage in the state of Pennsylvania, going back to one of those no-brainer things that for some reason never gets done. Again, good, bad, or indifferent on the fact that we have it, the threshold needs to be brought up into the year 2018. It hasn't been touched for 40 years. That's just insane. So why doesn't that ever get done? It seems like everyone across the aisle should agree on that, but for whatever reason, it doesn't happen. So I'll bring it to you. Yeah. Hey.
Yeah. I prompted myself to think of the question on the issue of sanctuary cities.
Right.
What would you do about that? Following up on that point is partly because with the school tax, school property tax, which is collected and needed to pay for education, part of that money, last I read, was it $1 billion? A lot of that money is going to fund illegal children in our schools. That's what we're paying for. So it's kind of a double gotcha. If we got the sanctuary cities and the illegals, we have our school taxes going up every year. What are you going to do about that?
Right. So that's it's not something that I've had to deal with in Lower Mackenzie Township. We are not a sanctuary township. Yeah. So we haven't had to deal with that, and it is something that does intersect on the periphery with state government. It has, as we've read, and I'm sure Dean can talk to you about this. It has come into play in Lehigh County government. But what I will say, because we're kind of segueing, and I don't mind talking about national issues at all, what I will say is across the board, one of the best things about President Trump is the refocus on nationwide conversation in respect to the sovereign borders of our nation. And so, we are a sovereign nation, and we shall have functioning borders. And we are a nation, as you know, built on immigration, but we believe in legal immigration. Yeah. So welcome. Doors are open, but get in line and follow the proper protocol.
Yeah. Well, but on the state level, now I just read where Governor Wolf.
Sure.
We're from Reading, so we can't vote for you, unfortunately, but I'm enjoying listening to you.
Sure.
They headlined an article of him coming out with 4 grand ideas for the electoral system, which his number one idea was anyone applying for a driver's license automatically can get put on the voter registration rolls. Hello, California. So we know what that's about.
Yeah.
Okay. So, but in lieu of that, so now that's a state issue. This is the governor. Out of the Department of Education, the Pennsylvania Department of Education, the taxpayers fund half of that money, and the state funds the other half for the schools. So that's why I'm back to the question of, as a state legislator, you can do something about sanctuary cities or not?
Yeah, I'm not familiar with the specifics of that. So.
Because that's one of the biggest drivers of the cost of that tax going up all the time.
Sure. Yeah. And I would imagine that that's a problem that's more prevalent in the city districts. I don't know how prevalent that problem is in East Penn, Perkiomen, Brandywine, Fleetwood. Yeah, I mean, I don't know what the numbers are in say the Reading area school district or the Allentown school district or Bethlehem. So, yeah. Good question, and I will get myself up to snuff on that. Yeah.
I see 2 questions. This gentleman here, and then Mr. Browning again, and 3 questions.
When I was in school, this is 1940, maybe a couple of years before that, we had our course what took us into, taught us about the education of the. I'm having trouble with my brain here, but we had a good course in education of the collection of our laws in school, and they still teach these kids how to run the Constitution. That's what I want to say. We did that, and I'm talking about just before high school, and I can remember all the stuff that we taught. It was great.
Yeah, I'm 20 years out, so I remember when I was in school I graduated in 1998. We did have civics lessons on the functionality of the federal Constitution, and even in college I took a class on the state Constitution, and that made sense, and I am a better citizen because of that. So yes, we absolutely should be doing a better job of teaching functional civics in high school, college, and every level of education. So in other words, how civics in the realm of how to be a better participant in our American democracy, where 85% of voters check out. That's a severe problem. So absolutely. Clearly, whatever we're doing now, it's not enough. So we need to do more.
This gentleman here has a question.
Yeah. Thanks, Mr. Durr.
You talked about term limits as being an answer to some questions. I guess my question to you is, what do you consider term limits for state people?
4 terms, 8 years. But the bigger problem with the State House is absolutely, without question, we need term limits. There has to be an expiration date on your service. Pennsylvania was founded going back to William Penn on a citizen legislature where you go in, you serve, and you go back to your job in the real world. In other words, you get out of the bubble. You get out of the Harrisburg bubble. So that's essential and critical. So we need the term limits. Personally, I favor 4 terms, 8 years. But going hand in hand with that issue is the fact that in the state of Pennsylvania, our state reps run 2-year terms, which I think is hugely problematic. The minute these state reps, and again, I'm really running against the system as opposed to any individual, but once these state reps, whether they come in with the best intentions, well intentions, good intentions, whatever, the problem is the day they win their election, day 2, they're fundraising and they're campaigning for the next election. So just as critical as it is to have term limits and expiration dates in the service and sending folks back to the real world, is just as critical to take another hard look at the length of their terms. So ideally, it would be 2 4-year terms for a total of 8 years, but we also have to address that 2-year term.
And I'm assuming that you would hold yourself to that also.
Absolutely. Yep.
Mr. Browning?
You know, and there's been some high-profile cases where folks have made promises when they're trying to get elected, and again, I'm not singling out anyone in particular, but you know, the issue is you have to believe in this to your core, and part of it is, you know, in order to commit that you're going to leave the position and go back to a job in the real world, is, you know, it's helpful to have a job in the real world when you go into it, you know, which I do. I have a career, I have a business, I love my business, I love what I do, and I would welcome the opportunity to go back to it after, you know, sacrificing and serving in Harrisburg for a number of years. So, Mr. Browning.
Yes, a comment to follow up on the young lady up front, and then also an unrelated question to follow up on Otto. Ma'am, just for your benefit, illegal immigrants in this country cost us net $116 billion every year. They pay roughly $19 billion in taxes, but the cost is $135 billion. Net cost $116 billion, sort of equally spread between federal, state, and local governments. A large portion of that is education, so that's the cost. My question to you is, last year, the Pennsylvania Senate passed a bill, SB 10, that passed with a veto-proof majority that would strip funding from any sanctuary jurisdiction in the state of Pennsylvania. And they defined a sanctuary jurisdiction as one where they refuse to honor detainer requests. So my question to you, one question is, would you be supportive of that or not? And then an unrelated question to follow up on a point that Otto was raising on voting. Would you be in favor of eliminating the option for straight party voting when people go in the voting booth?
Yeah, so the first part I'll handle second part first. Couple of things that I think are sensible reforms along that line. I would support legislation to eliminate straight party voting. I just think it makes sense. You still, of course, have the ability to cast your vote straight ticket, which I do almost most of the time, but you have to go through and physically choose the people. We vote for individuals, not parties. And a lot of times in this case, with the team sports mentality we have in the United States, we often have folks who, you know, run on one party or the other, but don't necessarily line up with what folks think are the values of that party. So, you know, anything that we can do to force people to vet candidates as individuals as opposed to whatever their jersey says, I think is a good thing. The other thing that I think is an interesting idea that the state of Maine does, and I would be supportive of exploring, is ranked choice voting. The state of Maine does that and has been enacting that to great success. So what that means is When you cast your vote in the ballot box, if there's a large number of folks running for a position, you rank 1, 2, 3. And the idea of this is you might have multiple rounds of voting, but at the end of the day, you're going to find the candidate that gets the true majority. I think that's a sensible government reform, and everything I read about their usage of that up in the state of Maine has been positive. So I do think that ranked choice voting is a good thing, and I do think that eliminating the ability to vote straight ticket would force voters to consider candidates as individuals instead of based on whatever jersey they're wearing. The first question, Senate Bill 10, I'm a little bit familiar with that. I did follow that closely when it was coming through, and in the general fashion that I understand it, I would be supportive of that, but the devil's in the details in terms of what's the legal standing of detainee, as long as, so immigration in general, right? I mean, just my general philosophy of government in the United States, there are very few things that the federal government should be taking the lead on, and that's a constitutional thing, right? And 10th Amendment, everything that's not explicitly outlined in the federal Constitution is then the purview of the states should they choose to tackle that issue. So, very limited amount of items that are actually the job of the federal government. One of those things is, without question, immigration, because that's a problem. And that was sensible, and the founders were very smart to put that in, because national immigration problems, or the sovereign status of our borders, doesn't end on a state-to-state basis. That's a federal problem. So as long as whatever the state legislation proposed lines up with and meshes with federal statutes, then that's what we ought to do. I mean, that direction and dictation is one of the few things, in fact, that should come from the federal government. We shouldn't encourage or allow states to sort of go rogue and come up with their individual policies as it relates to immigration laws. Our federal government does way too much right now. There's a number of things that the federal government does that is just simply not things that are outlined in the Constitution, and those things ought to be remanded and divested to the states. One of my favorite proposals, and I've written about this over the last couple of months, that the president has put forward, is his infrastructure plan, which really is based on getting the federal government out of carrying the lion's share of responsibility for state and local infrastructure funding. He's actually interested, and I think this is intelligent, to remand and divest those liabilities to the states and local governments. And what's that going to do? That's going to force state and local government to live within its means, because you're not going to build project X, Y, or Z without taking into account how your municipality is going to maintain that project perpetually going into the future. In other words, we're going to take away the able for states to go hat in hand to the federal government and say, bail me out.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, Ron, are you planning to make a closing statement? Or?
I can. I don't mind. If folks have more questions, I'll keep hammering away.
Well,
this is fun.
Before we go to any more closing statements or more questions, I'd like, as a matter of courtesy, since we heard that former First Lady Barbara Bush passed away, we would have a moment of silence in memory of the former First Lady. Thank you. Was there any other questions? John.
Ties in with a lot of the other stuff, grants, especially the public grant stuff. WAMs is what I would more call it.
Right.
Where there's CDBG things where they're looking for a project for somebody to fill so that they can give them grant money. What's your feeling on grants?
Right, and it's the same conversation that local municipalities have when they float bonds or establish lines of credit. It's made to order projects. I mean, and we just went through this in Lower Mac, and My dad and I actually opposed the narrative of establishing a line of credit to X without having projects established where the need was, because then what you have is you create and go out looking for projects to spend the amount of money that corresponds, whatever, the bond money, the grant money, the line of credit money that you now have available. So that is that's problematic, and that's a systemic problem. And so, you should have at the state and local government. This starts with, again, getting the federal government out of things that aren't constitutionally that they're not constitutionally obligated to handle, and breaking this sort of cycle of sending money up to beg for a nickel back. I mean, it all relates to that old saying. You send $1 to your local municipal government, you get 95 cents back. You know exactly where every penny of that dollar is being spent. You send $1 to Harrisburg, you beg for your quarterback, and you send $1 to the federal government. You get an IOU back, for China or something. So, the whole program, the whole system is incredibly and inherently wasteful when we're sending money up to be redistributed down. So I want, individual municipalities and states to have feedback on decisions they make. So, government in a whole should be flipped upside down. If Lower Mackenzie Township wants to, do XYZ project, then save money and do it. It's as simple as that. The bulk of spending decisions should be made at the local and state government levels. And, we shouldn't be engineering decision making based on what grants are and aren't available or what line of credit you established, and then, creating and concocting made to order projects just to spend every dollar that you have available. And we were pushing back in Lower Mac. With the farmland preservation efforts, we're largely paying for that with surplus money. So we're saving. We have a piggy bank, and we put money in the piggy bank, and we use that for our farmland preservation efforts, which we think pays dividends down the line. Spend $1 today, save $3 tomorrow. So, good question.
Any other questions, folks?
Yeah.
Okay, then if you have a closing statement.
Sure. Yeah. So, again, thanks everyone for coming out. I do appreciate the opportunity. When I announced that I was running for this back in November, the incumbent was at the time, running for U.S. Congress. I don't hold that against him. Unfortunately, so it was never my intent to necessarily, run against him or challenge him. I think he generally does a pretty decent job. And like I said, my issues and why I stayed in this race are twofold. One, he's never been primary before. So I think in our American democracy, giving people choice is a good thing. And that's why I'm still in this and committed to it and working hard at it. And number two, I also think that, and again, to go back to my original statement, I'm not necessarily running against him. I'm running against, the machine and the power of incumbency. Because in this state, there's a reason why 90% of incumbents in the state house get reelected. And that's because they have every advantage. So what I'm trying to do here is run a campaign. I've been able to raise money, the incumbent has about, I think it's $230,000 in his coffer, some incredible amount of money, because again, they fundraise 365 days a year from the moment they get in. I've been able to raise 10 grand. I'm very proud of that. My donations have come from, about 80 plus donations have come from an average of less than $100 per person. So I don't agree with Bernie Sanders' politics at all in any way, shape, or form. But what he did demonstrate is that you can raise money in large quantities in small increments. And so, I did that. And so we're trying to run a competitive campaign with a well-funded incumbent who, for better or worse, is a part of this machine on a shoestring budget. And, we're doing that. So what that means is, we're not hiring an expensive consultant. We're out there creating our own materials. which I hope are actually meaningful, because what you're getting, for better or worse, and everyone does it, is, candidates spend an incredible amount of money to stuff your mailbox with glossy, useless pieces of junk mail. And so I'm trying not to do that. I want to create pieces that actually tell you something about my campaign, what I stand for, and what I want to do. And God bless my wife, she's helping me out. We're sitting in the kitchen and we're stamping things and writing addresses on, and I'm out there doing doors, and my goal, and I'm on track to do this, is to hit 4,000 plus doors before May 15th election day. So it's my intent to do that. So what I really want to try to do here is demonstrate that you don't have to go to this playbook of having your hat in hand and begging for big checks from special interest groups, etc. I want to sort of prove here that I can be competitive in a race against a well-funded incumbent by not spending dollars, but by spending, shoe leather, and out there soliciting donations from regular people, my neighbors, and people who have seen the job we've done in Lower Mackenzie Township and think that we've done a good job. So with that in mind, well, the other thing is, I was sort of thinking about, as I was trying to go to sleep the last couple of nights, how I wanted to prepare for this. And what you quickly realize is when you're preparing for a debate, what you're really doing is preparing prepared answers. So I actually made a decision not to. I wanted to come up here and sort of respond to the questions that you asked me and try to do it in an honest and direct fashion, instead of giving you, all the sort of canned answers that you hear all the time, or really polished answers that people pay expensive consultants to help you make. So I hope that that's conveyed here, and what I tell people at the doors is always be wary. Put your antenna up if someone's knocking on your door and they're telling you everything that you want to hear, because politicians, especially when they're in the game for a long time, they become very good at it. You're not interviewing them, they're interviewing you. They knock on your door, knock, 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 and they're looking at bumper stickers on your car, they're looking for little cues, and then they're smart. They're giving you answers that they think you want to hear. I don't do that. I'm not wired for that. You ask me a question, I'm always going to give you the exact honest answer. Maybe sometimes we disagree, but I hope that you respect sincerity and honesty. And I think, especially knowing this room, that we're going to agree on probably 90% of the things, but there might be some things when we'll have a good discussion. So that's the kind of candidate I am, and that's the kind of campaign I want to run. And so I am running on the 15th. May 15th is the primary, and I would appreciate your consideration. So thank you so much, folks.
Ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the Concerned East Bend Taxpayers Association, we want to thank you for giving us a very interesting and informative evening. Ladies and gentlemen, then the meeting is adjourned. There's refreshments here, and